So let's start by generating positive altruistic motivation. So as before, we contemplate the minds of refuge and bodhicitta and faith or confidence, recognizing that the mind of confidence comes in part from understanding what all of the great masters of the past have accomplished on the basis of following the Buddha's teachings, and in part from our own experience to whatever degree we ourselves have put the teachings into practice and observed some reduction, even temporarily, of afflicted states, which demonstrates that afflicted states are not in the nature of the mind, that when appropriate antidotes are introduced, those afflicted states are similarly reduced, which means ultimately, through the continuation of effort and training, those antidotes can be eliminated completely. And on the basis of that confidence, we understand the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners who have internalized his teachings to be genuine sources of refuge, ultimate sources of protection from the fears of samsara, the shortcomings of samsara. And on the basis of generating that refuge, we recognize that we are not alone in facing those fears, those shortcomings. All sentient beings are in the same boat. They are all subject to the sufferings of cyclic existence. And so it's insufficient to wish for one's own liberation alone. The greatest, best, most sublime motivation is the mind of bodhicitta that wishes for the enlightenment of all sentient beings, and not only wishes but engages in the training that can bring about one's own enlightenment so that one has the tools, the ability to lead all sentient beings to their own enlightenment. So we generate those minds as our motivation. All right. So we would be beginning today with day 345. We're in the final section on the nature of reality, on emptiness, voidness, and we are looking particularly at what we could call the selflessness of persons in this section here, this sort of subsection. It is important from the Madhyamaka Prasangika perspective to realize both the selflessness of persons and the selflessness of phenomena. But it's always the case that what's primarily recommended to begin taking as the object is the ego identity, because subjectively, we are the originator of our own samsara. The ignorance that exists in our own mind is the originator of our own samsara. And so the selflessness of phenomena, things other than oneself, is can be realized in the same way. It's not different. It's just to say that the analysis that we do to realize emptiness is applicable to oneself and anything that isn't oneself. All things lack inherent existence. The self does, and tables and chairs and you know cats and dogs and whatnot. All non-self entities are empty, and that emptiness can be established through the same processes, the same contemplations. But because ignorance resides in the mind, we take the self as the main initial, at least, object. Um, and then, what they say is that once we realize that using the object of the self, then it's quite easy at that point. Well, if you take that object all the way through to a direct non-conceptual realization, then extending that to phenomena is quite easy, once you've gone all of that way, taking the self as the object. And so that's what Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe are kind of focusing in on here, is understanding the selflessness of persons, meaning, um, you know, particularly meaning one's own person, one's own body mind complex, the aggregates. And so that's where we are generally. Any questions from last time? And again, if you do and you don't want to be in the video, you'll have to turn off your camera.
Well, I think I did have a question, but it was so fleeting. It was kind of like a bit of a dream. I don't remember what it was, but I just emptiness in general. I mean, starting with ego, but going as far as you can. And I think the concepts that catch me are that emptiness is also empty. That everything is empty, and as I say, you kind of go so far in your mind with that contemplation, and then I stumble a little bit at some point.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's, certainly, you know, the, I mean, even of course, the idea, this thing that we're striving for of Buddhahood is also empty of inherent existence. And it's like, well, that's everything that we're devoting all of our time and our energy in it. But it seems like that should be a thing. But, so it doesn't, of course, it's important to understand that it doesn't mean that, with emptiness is not, isn't what you would call a um, a functioning thing. It's not. It doesn't. It emptiness is, unlike, say, you know the body mind complex, or a, an enlightened being, or even the law of karma. Those can be empty and yet still function. They can still bring about results. They can still um, cause, that they can still generate change and influence things, unlike, say, for example, a dream. Like that, we can say that there's a there's still a difference between the emptiness of a functioning thing and the emptiness of a non-functioning thing. A dream state is also empty of inherent existence, right? You go to sleep and you think that you're a pilgrim, or you think that, you're flying or what have you, and you're not. No one else shared that experience. No one else valid. It's not a valid cognition, right? It wasn't. It was just a, in a way, a hallucination. It's not validated by, you can't. There's no basis of validly saying, I am a pilgrim, or I am the president of this country that I imagined myself to be, and whatnot. um, but it was an experience that arose on the basis of causes and conditions. You can say because it arose in the mind, there were different mental aspects to it. So in that sense, you can say that it had parts. um, and you can say that it was therefore, and then the mind labeled what was being experienced, and based on prior knowledge, based on, you know cultural understanding. It was given context, it was given meaning. So in that sense, we can label it as empty, but we can't. It's not a functioning thing, unlike a real person in the waking world who can talk and pick things up and, you know interact with other people and make changes in the world that are observed by other sentient beings and are validated by other sentient beings. Buddhas can help to activate positive karma in the mind of a specific sentient being at a specific time and place. They're generating change, and yet, so they are functioning things that are also empty of inherent existence. And emptiness is just a concept. It's like the idea of, ethics. In a way, we can say this is ethical and this is not ethical on the basis of mental, um, events, mental permutations. We can analyze. We can say, well, given this set of, if we're going to define, you have to define it. You have to say, this is how we're going to perform the analysis. Say these are the rules that we're going to use, and so on. And then on the basis, and you can do that in different ways. You could do that on the basis of, like with regard to ethics. Let's say you could do that on the basis of the greatest good for the greatest number, right? And you could say, well, that's how I'm going to define what is ethical or what is not ethical. That's my rule system. Another rule system, would be like a Kantian maxim, and so then it's a totally separate, system, and the two might arrive at different, results. You might say, well, in one scenario, this is ethical. In another scenario, it's not ethical, because you've defined it differently. You're using different ideas about what is. And that's really what emptiness is. It's a way of analyzing. It's a way of deciding, okay, if this, then that, given this set of rules, given this way of analyzing, this is the outcome. This is what is observed. And so to say that something is empty means that it appears to exist. It's not emptiness isn't a substance. Like I say, it's a non-functioning thing. It's not like a functional aspect of reality. It's not a substance. It's not something that is, it is a quality of the difference between, it's a quality of observable or cognizable reality in relation to minds, in relation to cognizers. It's so really, emptiness is a critique of how cognizers cognize. Um, that really all it is. It's a way of analyzing the process of cognition and critiquing how that process is unfolding, and just making the observation that for an uncritical, unanalyzed cognizer, they are they are interacting with reality in a way that seems to them to be concrete and findable and very again, things seem to be set up from their own side. They seem to have their own inherent existence and so on. And yet, if you decide, and again, so it's definitional in a way, in the sense that you have to define what it means to look for the object. So you say, okay, I, as a cognizer, as an ordinary sentient being engaging in cognition, when I make an observation or a cognition, it is true that in that experience, that which I'm cognizing seems to me subjectively to be completely separate from my subjectivity, from my active cognition. It seems to me that when I leave a room and go into another room and there's a bed in said room, that bed was there before I got there. It's going to be there when I leave. It's just, it's completely separate from me. I'm not creating it by my active observation. I'm not generating it. It is just out there. It's, doing its own thing. It's hanging out. And sometimes I happen to go by, I happen to observe it completely passively. That's my own experience subjectively. And the way in which this is kind of like, looking for what is or isn't ethical as a corollary is what the Buddha says is, okay, if that's true, then there must be something findable in the object itself when you search for it, when you break that object down and you look at it from a whole bunch of different angles, and you do different ways. And of course, I'm using here an external example and not the self, but um, it's applicable to all things equally. So the Buddha is just saying, if our cognition is valid, if our own subjective experience is valid, then we should be able to identify that which is giving rise to the experience of that object being separate from oneself and having its own entity, its own essence, its own tableness or chairness or carness. Because that is our subjective experience of objects. um it's really, as I say, it's just a critique of how sentient beings generate knowledge about that which they cognize. um, just like there's different ways of arriving at an understanding of what is justice, or what is ethics, or what is kindness, or like the Buddha defines love as the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be happy and to have the causes of happiness. Somebody else could think that it's something else, right? Somebody else could define love as in a different way. Love for the Buddha is the wish for oneself and all other sentient beings to be happy and to have the causes of happiness. Um, so emptiness is just a way of thinking about how we as cognizing beings are going about the acts of cognition that we are going about. So when we say that something is empty, it simply means that subjectively our experience of it is other than our same experience of it before or after we try to identify why it is that our perception of the object is one in which that object seems to have its own identity and seems to be separate and seems to have an essence. Um, before we look for a reason why that perception is our perception, it just is our perception. We're just sort of we're just having cognitions, and it just is that way. When we actually try to pinpoint, okay, well, why is it that way? Like, if you were to think about why does something look brown rather than green, you know, then you could come up with an explanation. You could say, well, part of it is my biology. There's certain rods and cones in my eyes that are sensitive to certain wavelengths, and then there's parts of my brain that that code certain things, and that's why some reliably, when I look at green and when I look at, and if you don't do that, then you would just think, oh well, green is out there and it's separate from me, and it's not, it's just that just is green. You wouldn't think, well, no, but it's actually, there are reasons why it is, and it's not why it is this and it's not that. um, and then you have a deeper understanding of the same thing. You've arrived now at a clearer, more precise, more accurate description of your own act of engaging in observation or cognition. So when we can become aware that things are empty of inherent existence, now we just recognize that their appearance to us as things that seem separate and seem to have an essence and seem to have nothing to do with us is not actually based on anything that is observable or pointable or findable in the object itself. That it is kind of a figment of our imagination. It is something that we have just kind of um, layered on top of all of what's really there about the object. Um, excuse me. So, yeah, I mean, the emptiness of emptiness. I think I think we can kind of set that aside. I mean, it's not something that we need, if that's kind of like a little bit mind bendy. The emptiness of the ego, of the self, is mind bendy enough. Like, we can just kind of stick with that, and just kind of look for, just kind of do this analysis on the basis of the body mind complex. And then I would assume that through that process, as a person gets more and more familiar, then it becomes less jarring in a way to kind of extend that to other things. But so I would say, let me let me oh, did I not? Sorry, I don't know that what did I do? I'm unprepared.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Yep.
In your day-to-day life, are you able to use that cognition more and more, or is it mostly in meditation that you have that, either that cognition of the emptiness of things, or, as I say, is that more mostly in meditation? Is it more and more in your life that you're sensing that you remind yourself of that, or that it comes to you just in observation?
I mean, I think that's the kind of the premise of analytical meditation generally, is that regardless of whether it's, let me see if I can make myself look less like I'm in an episode of Batman and climbing a wall. Um, I may not be able to. I don't know what's going on. Hmm. Nope, that's not how we do that. That's a little bit better. I always think of that whenever this happens because I used to watch Batman as a kid and they would do the like sideways climbing the wall. Um, so yeah, I mean, so I think that the fundamental premise of any analytical meditation is that the reason that it isn't, whether it's insight into, um, karma or impermanence or love and kindness or what have you, the reason that it isn't easily available in daily life, it's not top of mind, is just due to a lack of familiarity. It's just due to not having deeply integrated, that way of understanding the world. And that's the purpose of analytical meditation. So, I mean, over time, we should find that, we remember, those insights more and more as we're, going about it, and of course, it's also true that, it's that particular insight is very subtle, and I think it requires a, um, a stillness of mind, or because of course life is quite hectic and quite, so there are other antidotes that are maybe more immediately available generally, um, rather than like, actually trying to like pick things apart and say like, oh, this is, um, so, but yeah, I would say that that's the intent of all analytical meditations, is that it does bleed over into daily life. But I mean, I think it's also true that until a person has fully qualified calm abiding, then, I mean, there's a variety of things that are definitely true. One is that, um, there's a huge difference, even, I mean, even for a person who's directly realized, emptiness, which I'm nowhere. I mean, it's absurd how, how far away that is, in my own experience. But they say that, of course, when a person, even a person at that level, that the appearance of a concrete reality reasserts itself outside of meditation, and they just sort of have the tools to not get totally sucked into that appearance, but that appearance still arises. um, so I think that definitely meditation provides a, but that's true, I mean, that's, again, that's true of all of the analytical meditations. uh, the meditation itself provides a very calm, very peaceful, undistracted state in which we can cultivate, you know, wisdom realizing emptiness, or wisdom realizing impermanence, or, whatever it might be. And then when we're faced with all of the busyness and distraction, of the outside world, of course, it's going to be more difficult. Um, so there's always a difference, I think, but over time, again, just with familiarity, with repetition, the hope would be that it that we would narrow that gap.
And would you say that the tantric practices go hand in hand with that? That the deity yoga is part of that training to, I don't want to say remove yourself, but to mm, be more open to those states of mind?
Yeah, yeah, I think that it's certainly it's a very skillful way of um, letting go of the concreteness with which we hold ourselves, and you know, to recognize that it's it's even more valid to say that I can arise in a purified form than it is to say that I'm just this kind of narrow, constricted collection of preferences and dislikes and experiences, um, because the emptiness of the mind is our essential nature, and those coarse level thoughts are not. Um, yeah, but of course, I mean, this is a this teachings, and so it's also certainly there's sutra, this all of these descriptions are sutra based ways of analyzing and coming to an understanding of the groundlessness of things. And people, as we've said, throughout the course, people shouldn't feel like they should kind of rush into something, that's that maybe they're not prepared for. um, but I think that it's also a very, very skillful method for um, reducing the self-grasping that's at the core of our afflictions.
Thank you. I appreciate all that.
So day 345, the I exists simply because the mind applies a temporary label to a bubble-like collection of parts. That's Lama Yeshe in day 345. So here, Lama Yeshe is talking about the false I, or the concretized I, which um, is labeling. Here he says a bubble-like collection of parts. So, um, you know, if we look at the foundation of all good qualities, Lama Tsongkhapa says this life is like a water bubble. Remember how quickly it decays and death comes. So I think that's kind of what he's getting at, the how fragile and how insubstantial, just one lifetime is. And yet that's what the coarse mind, the gross mind, has access to, is just the experiences of just the past however many number of years, and of course our familiarity with this one physical form that our mind happens to be associated with for that incredibly brief period of time. um, and so the mind observes body and mind, and then labels that in this concretized way that is a fiction, in this way that where the ego identity is something that we perceive of as existing over and in mind. Um, and as Venerable Rabina says, it's just unnecessary to create this third thing. Yes, there is body. Yes, there is mind, but there is no owner of body and mind. There is nothing that supersedes or is that which controls both body and mind, which is how we think of ourselves. We sometimes think, I'm happy, or my finger hurts, or I'm going to the store, or I'm daydreaming. We have this I that can do that, be the director, be the puppeteer of both body and mind. And that puppeteer is a false, is a fiction, is not accurate. It's not necessary. It doesn't refer to anything. It's just how we relate to the body and mind. But there's no need to relate to the body and mind in that way. There is a body, there is a mind, and they are interrelated. But the body does what it does, and the mind does what it does, and they are, there's relation between the two. Um, but this idea of of some kind of third thing that's pulling the strings, that isn't something that exists, but we perceive it to exist. We think that it does. So he says, my superstition gives my superstition gives the name to Yeshe, to this bubble of relativity, and my ego starts to feel that Tupten Yeshe really does exist somewhere in the area of the body. The ego's instinctive feeling, he says, that Tupten Yeshe exists somewhere around here is very superficial. He says we can see that the relative reality of Tupten Yeshe is simply the name that's been given to this bubble of energy. That's all Tupten Yeshe is. He says, if I were to show up somewhere and announce suddenly, you're all merely names, people would think I was crazy. But if we investigate in detail the manner in which we're all merely names, it becomes extremely clear. So again, that's the process of this analysis. That's what emptiness, is the end result. It's just the unfindability of that puppeteer. We again, as we mentioned in the previous class, one way that we can get an entry point into this concept of our ego identity is to recollect a time when we felt somewhat threatened or somewhat embarrassed or somewhat indignant, some sort of righteous indignation. Those three kinds of experiences cause the ego identity to very, very strongly assert itself. And this ego identity feels like this really findable, really concrete thing that seems to be over and above, or the owner of, both body and mind. But, in order to recognize the emptiness of that, we just have to say, okay, it's true that when, I remember feeling embarrassed, feeling righteously indignant, or feeling somehow threatened, threatened for my safety, what have you. And in all of those instances, this really, really strong, how dare this happen? How dare you say that? I can't believe this is happening to me. We feel like something struck, a core. We felt like something really hit our true ego identity in those kinds of experiences. So then we just say, okay, well, what is it? How do I tell someone this is why? What do I point to? What's findable about that experience? How do I explain to someone logically, rationally, here is the thing that is responsible for this experience? So we think, well, of course, just like if I were to explain to someone why I see the color green, I could do that. I could say, well, again, because the sun emits this kind of light and it reflects on this kind of object, and that reflection enters my eyeballs, and my eyeballs have these rods and cones, and my brain has these sorts of structures, and that gives rise to this experience. We could logically do that. And so conventionally speaking, green is a thing that we can speak about, we can identify conventionally. Of course, because green only exists independent upon all of those things, green is empty of inherent existence, but still, logically we can describe it. We can describe that process to someone. But can we describe the feeling? So in a way, doing that is a way of describing in part why green is empty of inherent existence. That's true. But so it can in that way undermine the sense, if we if we had the sense that the green existed out there separate from me, then that would undermine that. If, though, we're simply just trying to describe why there is green as an experience, then that would be a valid way of going about that. So we should then be able to describe why we relate to ourselves in this concretized way. We should be able to say, well, here, this is the reason I can point to why I have this experience. And the Buddha just says, when you try, when you look, you never find. You're left with an inability to express the origin, cause, the pointable, findable root of what we do experience. And that's we and then all we have to do is rest in the unfindability of what we previously were experiencing. This seemed to be really solid, really independent, really out there. And so I got curious and I wanted to try to figure out, why is it that I'm having that experience? And so I do an analysis, I investigate, and the fruit of my investigation is that I'm left with nothing. I'm left with no findable, pointable, identifiable cause of my experience. So my experience is then sort of fabricated. It's something that the mind just kind of added unnecessarily to my cognition. It just sort of layered it there on top without a good reason. It just kind of, it was easier. It was a sort of a shortcut. And we just sort of plastered on this solidity, this concreteness that we can't really say we ever had a good reason for doing. Just like there's no good reason to postulate a when the body and trick, and pointing out that there is body and there is mind and they are associated. That does it. That explains everything. That takes you as far as you need to go. Of course, body and mind individually can be analyzed in terms of our experience of them individually, as also individually having concrete reality and lacking that concrete reality. And we need to do that too. So again, that's kind of the rabbit hole of negating and negating and negating as you search. But yeah, so what he's getting at here is that the subtlest way in which we can identify things as being empty is to exist as mere designation, as mere name. So things are empty of inherent existence because they do exist as dependent arisings. This isn't to say, and we talked before about not negating too much and not going into nihilism. So we recognize that things do exist. The body does exist, the mind does exist, phenomena do exist, but how do they exist? They exist as dependent arisings. And so they arise in dependence on three baskets of things: their causes and their conditions, their parts. And then the third is the one that Lama Yeshe here is getting at, an act of mental imputation or labeling or designation that is calling it something that we then use, that we then use in conversation, that we then use as a point of reference in our own mind. So, we look at a table and we call it a table. We don't call it a washing machine. We don't call it a bed. We don't call it a car. we say it's a table, and we distinguish it from from a washing machine or a giraffe, or because it has unique qualities, and so on a conventional level, because it performs a specific function, and it has certain qualities, and it falls into a particular range that isn't shared, doesn't overlap. Dogs and tables don't, the Venn diagram of dogs and tables pretty far apart. There's not a lot of overlap, and so we don't really get confused about that, because the function that a dog performs and the function that a table performs, very, very different. So quite easy to distinguish. But they're both just labeled by the mind independent upon their unique causes and conditions and their unique parts. And on the basis of their unique causes and their conditions and unique parts, they perform unique functions. And whereas it's more difficult to distinguish between a cup and a mug. Cups and mugs, some people might disagree. Like, well, no, that's not a cup, that's a mug, because it's a little bit bigger, it has a different kind of handle, but they both, you can drink water out of both of them. You can drink, also tea, also coffee, also, they perform largely the same function, but it's a much subtler distinction between a cup and a mug. But we kind of intuitively know, if it's porcelain, if it's very, very breakable, if it's flimsy, we're not going to call it, if it only holds 4 ounces, 6 ounces, we kind of intuitively would say, well, no, that's not, like, if it can hold 14 ounces, if it's quite thick walled, if it has a large kind of robust handle, then we would say, well, okay, generally speaking, that's a mug. But still, they perform very, very similar functions. So we're just sort of splitting hairs in a way, and labeling things again based on unique qualities and and uh, causes and conditions, and again, unique parts. Like, this is thicker in the width of its wall, this has a larger handle, so the parts are slightly different, and so we make up a whole new mental designation, a whole new mental category. We have a category of mugs, and then we have a category of cups, just because we invented things for slightly different functions. Um, but airplanes and cars, we also invented for very different functions. One we wanted to fly, and one we wanted to drive. And so again, they have unique causes and conditions, they have unique parts, they have unique functions, and therefore the mind will give them unique mental designations, mental labels. But that's the subtlest of the three, to say that it only exists in mere name, it only exists as a mental label, as a designation, because you know is a you know that is a product of culture, that is a product of human intelligence, human experience. Different cultures may not have a mental framework that's similar enough to give rise. If a mug existed from its own side, um, any sentient being could observe the mug and come up with the correct label, come up with the correct designation, because the object really did have an essence that all cognizers would be able to pick up on, would be able to, you know, to notice. Because in that instance, if we lived in that kind of world, if that was how the universe worked, then our perception of cognition as passive would be valid. And if our perception of cognition as passive is valid, all cognizers would arrive at the same labels for all objects all of the time. There would be universal agreement. But that's not true. There's all kinds of disagreement based on different cultures, based on different experiences, even subtle distinctions like, not that this is a car or what, but this is an attractive car, or this is an unattractive car, or this is a delicious piece of food, or a disgusting piece of food. These are all labels. These are all um, mere imputations, mere designations by mind. And there's no agreement among sentient beings because there's nothing from the side of the object that's actually giving rise to that label, to that designation, to that imputation. It's a very, very active mental process that's creating that reality, that's creating that experience. So it does exist, there is something there, but the way that it's being perceived and the way that in which it actually exists are different. Um, it's being perceived, oh, it's truly delicious, it's truly attractive, it's truly, from its own side, independent of me, separate from me, and I'm just helpless to notice that that's true about the object. I'm just, I'm a cognizer in the world, and that is how the object exists. And so it's broadcasting that essence to me, and I have no choice but to move toward the chocolate cake and move away from the asparagus. And um, because those are qualities that are present in the objects. Um, and so, that's how we think. That's how we go about our lives. And the Buddha just says that that's something that we're making up. That's not valid. Um, I don't mean
I,
to disparage asparagus. I had asparagus for lunch, and asparagus is delicious. Intrinsically, from its own side.
I've got a couple of questions that that have risen just in listening to you. And one is it backtracking a little bit. Um, if 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 I am almost struck by a car and I jump back and feel this sense of this just frightened solid self, is that um, is that my ego recognizing an adrenaline jolt? That I've been jolted physically with this, fight or flight chemical, and that's really all that is? It's just that ego has labeled what happened as a freaked out moment and nothing more.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the mind too. I mean, I think it's because I mean that can arise in all kinds of different ways. This idea of threat, even when we just imagine, like we can get worked up about just, you know, imagining that someone is going to say a certain, like if we have a presentation or something and we like doom, we like think, oh, when I'm going to do this, it's going to be terrible, people are going to laugh at me, and then we get kind of all worked up and nothing has actually even happened, right? So I think in a way, so certainly the grasping is there before, right? The grasping has to be there before in order for the event to trigger the sense of something happening, and so the event is just shining a light on the grasping that was there before. um, so it wasn't like the grasping arose simultaneous with the event just made us notice what we were grasping at. And so certainly the there certainly is a cascade of physical changes. um the the Dalai Lama will kind of ask the question about some of things like that. What's the actual causality, though? Like, um, yes, we can observe physical changes in the body, um, but is it possible that it was actually a moment of mind that preceded them that was just really quick, really subtle, and it was what set off that cascade of changes? So what I would say is that there was a threat that was perceived, but really we perceive physical threats. We also perceive like being insulted as a threat, to our reputation, like in a way. And so sometimes we're grasping at continued existence, in this life, and sometimes we're grasping at wanting to be in a particular way or thought of in a particular way, um, or treated in a particular way. And there's a threat to any one of those ways in which we are wanting for the I to be experiencing, to be, and it's being prevented in some way, and that's very uncomfortable, that's very painful. So in a situation like that, of course, it's really that we recognize that there's an actual danger to, um, our own continued existence. But you can look at the neurobiology literature and things, and they would say that we also, this kind of chronic stress that people experience, and that fight or, like you're saying, the fight or flight, like that's triggered. That kind of internal biological system can be triggered by traffic, can be triggered by somebody, say, that kind of system, the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous systems. It isn't only triggered, that's kind of one of the, that's why stress is such a, because if it's elevated all of the time, we have these systems, biological systems, that were meant to be activated only when, like, the bear was actually charging, and when we actually, we saw the cougar, or we heard the sound of the, and we really did need to. And now it's kind of being activated by all kinds of things, and so I don't know that it's just a state change in a biological system, because then, like, what's the real trigger for that state change? I think that in general, what Buddhism is kind of pointing out is that all of these things, they are interfering with self-grasping and self-cherishing. And the self-grasping and the self-cherishing is our baseline state. It's just present in every moment of our lives. And anything that interferes with that is going to then cause a cascade of thoughts, a cascade of physical changes. And certainly on a course level, when the mind doesn't have access to the deeper, subtler levels of the mind, the things that are going to be really noticeable, is the heart rate, is the elevated breathing, is these coarse things. Those are going to be very easy things for us to notice. Um, yeah, that's. Do you had other thoughts, questions?
I did. I can't remember what it was. I did. I was wondering, just on a personal level, did you do a lot of debating in your studies? Was that part
Um,
of your rigorous?
no, I in high school I did competitive speech and debate in high school, which was very helpful. I thought that was enormously helpful in my, development, in developing an interest in reading and philosophy and different things. But in terms of Buddhism, no.
Okay. Interesting. Well, however it fit into your life, it is serving you well. Yeah. Very cool. Thank you.
Okay, so we are out of time for today. The website, I think the website doesn't show the class. Did was change the title and the whole class disappeared. So we are meeting on Thursday. I just have to fix the website. And then I guess at some point we can decide if we're meeting on Christmas Day. I'm happy to, but if people are busy, then we can skip it. That would be the only other thing to decide. Unless there's a puja next week, there might be. Anywho, but we are meeting on Thursday, despite I think the calendar not indicating that at present. So we'll end with dedication. So bring to mind our altruistic intention and think that by having listened and engaged with the material, we have created positive energy in the mind, we've actualized that motivation, that intention. So we offer the fruit of our practice for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. So think of how you individually wish to offer the fruit of your practice, the ways in which you would like that positive energy to ripen in spiritually beneficial and meaningful ways. Very, very strongly dedicate that positive energy to bring about those virtuous results. All right. So, as I said, I will be back on Thursday.
Thanks very much.